Thank you very much, Kelsey. It takes teamwork sometimes. All right. Okay, this meeting is being recorded. Sudbury TV has let us know that they will be able to air any meetings or programs for us in this meeting, as well as the 2020 Farnware annual meeting, which took place via Zoom last September, will be available soon on Sudbury TV. Also, Stowe TV contacted us today to inquire about airing this meeting. We will begin with an overview of Friends activity since our last meeting in September 2020, and next, Karen Lund will present the Farnware Financial Report, followed by an overview of the Eastern Mass Refuge Complex and introduction to Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge, presented by U.S. Fish and Wildlife staff Kelsey Mackey. After the business meeting, Friends board members Jan Wright and Chris Stahl will present our featured program, History of the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge. I'm happy to share with you that the Friends membership is in the process of voting in by email the 2021 to 2022 board slate, and a confirmation number of 15 votes has been achieved. This means our board has been re-elected, including our new treasurer candidate. Officer elections for president, clerk, and treasurer will take place at the Friends May board meeting. Once again, a reminder that all attendees are muted. Please turn off video during the meeting. For questions and comments during the meeting, the chat box will be monitored by Kelsey. After each presentation, we will pause to answer any questions you may have. At this stage in the pandemic, the Friends are continuing to work with Fish and Wildlife Service project leader Lynn Fu and our Friends Liaison Visitor Services Specialist Kelsey to stay up to date on the latest guidelines. At this time, the Visitor Center remains closed indefinitely, and we thank you for your patience and support. With the Visitor Center closed, we will be providing outdoor, safe, masked, socially distanced outreach. Our goal is to provide outreach which is especially helpful for first-time visitors to the refuge on Saturdays, Sundays, and also weekdays, provided volunteers are available and the weather is favorable. In May and June, we are looking forward to presenting public programs via Zoom. On Wednesday, May 19th, with funding provided by a Racial Equity and Inclusion grant from the Sudbury Foundation, Parker McMullen Bushman of Inclusive Journeys will offer a presentation about her project, the Digital Green Book. As described on their website, Inclusive Journeys is a company that works to identify safe and welcoming places for all. Their first project is the Digital Green Book. They are working to build a website that is like Yelp, but for inclusivity. On Monday, June 21st, the first day of Pollinator Week, Mila De Souza will offer a program, Choosing Pollinator-Friendly Plants, Understanding Nature's Complex Connections. Pollinator Week is an annual event celebrated internationally in support of pollinator health. For more information, their website is www.pollinator.org. And on Wednesday, June 23rd, children's book author Julie Beaver, who lives in Texas, will share her inspiration and writing process and then read aloud her book, A House for Wren. This is a family-friendly program for people of all ages. From the fall of 2020 up to present, the Friends have participated in gatherings and collaborated with several local conservation organizations, and we value these important relationships. Included are Sudbury Doing Good Coffee and Conversation meetings, an invitation to meet the new Maynard Library Director, Jean McGuire, the Sudbury Lions Club, and co-sponsored programs with Lincoln Sudbury Adult Ed. The Friends have benefited from 2 grants that have allowed us to work on strengthening our Friends Board and our work on racial equity and inclusion. Each grant has allowed us the opportunity to collaborate with other groups, Friends groups at refuges in Mashpee, Monomoy, Parker River, and Rachel Carson in Maine, as well as other local conservation organizations, including ORS, Sudbury Valley Trustees, and the Nashua River Watershed Association. With thanks for your generous Friends member dues and donations in the fall of 2020, those funds provided for landscaping work at the Hudson Road main gate. And this spring, were put to good use in replacing old, dated kiosk maps with updated durable maps for the 5 kiosks on the refuge. And the Blandings Turtle Repatriation Project. Please join us in supporting and protecting the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge. Along with the outreach, community involvement, and public programs overview just presented, there are other ways you may wish to contribute your time and skills. Please visit our website where you will find a recently updated calendar of events. And we would love to hear from you. Please contact us at our email address, info@farnwar.org. And now it is time for our Farnwar Financial Report, presented by Karen Lund. We wish to thank Karen for her 6 years of service as treasurer, and we are delighted that she will be staying involved as an admin volunteer.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Karen Lund, and I'm the current treasurer of Farnwar. As Paula had mentioned, I will be resigning as of the May meeting, and we have a new candidate who will be coming on to replace me. I've enjoyed the last 6 years that I've worked with the refuge, but unfortunately, due to some other restrictions within my life, I need to roll off for a little bit. Tonight, I will be presenting a brief recap of the 2020 financials. I will begin with the first slide, which details the income we've received. Despite the state of affairs in 2020, the total memberships received was on par with other recent years and remains consistent with our active membership base. We had increases in donations received with memberships this year as compared to previous years, likely as a result of our increased support initiative. We also had one large memorial donation as well last year. Significant items of note are the funds we received as a result of the Friends of Oxbow's dissolution in the fall of 2020 of approximately $32,000. Those funds came to us in the form of a restricted donation specifically for the use of the Oxbow Refuge and are currently being held in escrow until the dissolution has been finalized. We also received 2 grants in 2020, $2,500 from the Sudbury Foundation, which is allocated for a racial equity and inclusion program to be held later in 2021. We also received $4,400 from National Wildlife Service as a peer-to-peer grant used by the Northeast region of Friends Wildlife Refuges to focus on strategic and financial planning initiatives. A series of workshops was held in the later part of 2020 and early 2021. The Friends groups represented at those workshops were Assabet, Mashpee, Oxbow, Rachel Carson, Monomoy, and the Parker River. The expenses for 2020 were lower than in previous years, as would be expected. With the closure of the visitor center, limitations on gatherings and other in-person initiatives that could be done, our events and operations were much lower than in prior years. These limitations primarily affected the nature store, as well as our monthly speaker programs. The Friends were able to support a cleanup effort at the front gate of the complex, which cost approximately $2,800. Normal recurring expense, such as administrative and operational costs, accounted for the remainder of the expenses. One other item of note is the $1,250 from the Oxbow grant, which was used toward their legal costs associated with their dissolution. On the balance sheet, with the nature store closed, the inventory remains static. Our total assets increased primarily as a result of the $32,000 in restricted funds coming in from the Oxbow Refuge. So this concludes my 2020 financial remarks, and I'm now going to pass the presentation to U.S. Fish and Wildlife staff, Kelsey Mackey, who's going to give an overview of the Eastern Refuge Complex and introduction to the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge.
Thank you, Karen. Just give me a moment to share my screen. Can you see my screen, Chris? Excellent. All right, so while this loads, hello everyone. My name is Kelsey Mackey. I am the Park Ranger or the Visitor Services Specialist for the Eastern Massachusetts National Wildlife Refuge Complex. In this presentation, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the complex and take a little bit of a closer look at the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge. I'd first like to start my piece of the presentation with a land acknowledgement to acknowledge the traditional territory and recognize its longer history prior to colonization and its significance for the indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live on this land and in this territory. And so I'm joining you tonight from the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge's Visitor Center, which is on the homeland of the Nipmuc and Pawtucket peoples. The Nipmuc and Pawtucket have lived here for many thousands of years, and indigenous peoples from other Native nations also reside in the state of Massachusetts. And it's important to protect and honor the history and the people of these places that we live and work. And so with that, I will start my presentation. So just a little bit about us. You can see the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge is one of 8 national wildlife refuges within the Eastern Massachusetts National Wildlife Refuge Complex. The refuge complex is part of the National Wildlife Refuge System, which is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the service is a bureau within the Department of the Interior. More about Department of the Interior. It's a very broad agency that manages America's natural and cultural resources. You can see the Fish and Wildlife Service highlighted here, as well as the other our other sister agencies, which include the Park Service. And so I like to highlight the differences in the mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service, since it seems like a lot of folks often confuse refuges with national parks, and they are a little different in their missions and how they're managed. And so if you take a look at the mission of the service, it specifically says to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, plants, habitat. So really it's wildlife first. And then if you take a look at the National Park Service mission, you can see in their mission, it's natural and cultural resources as well as outdoor recreation. And so that's kind of the difference in how these lands are managed and what activities allowed are, like how they're prioritized on these public lands. And so more about the National Wildlife Refuge System, founded by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1903. The National Wildlife Refuge System is a diverse network of lands and waters dedicated to conserving ecosystems and the fish and wildlife that rely on them. And each refuge is established to serve a statutory purpose that targets the conservation of native species dependent on its land and waters. And so there are currently about 569 national wildlife refuges across the United States. The National Wildlife Refuge System and the Fish and Wildlife Service has 6 priority public uses. We call these the Big 6. Assabet River has all 6 of these opportunities on the refuge: hunting, fishing, environmental ed, interpretation, wildlife observation. Most popular is bird watching, and then wildlife photography. And so I just want to take a minute to talk about hunting. That seems like it's the public use that I get the most questions about. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service manages the Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program. And this program works with states, insular areas, and District of Columbia to conserve, protect, enhance fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats, and also the hunting, sport fishing, and recreational boating opportunities they provide. And so wildlife sport Fish Restoration, WISFR for short, provides oversight and administrative support for various grant programs, including Wildlife Restoration Grant, Sport Fish Restoration Grant, Clean Vessel Act Grant Program, National Coastal Wetlands Conservation Grant Program. The list goes on and on. There's two acts in particular I want to highlight about hunting: the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act of 1937 and the Dingell-Johnson Sport Fish Restoration Act of 1950. And so these two programs provide funding to states and territories for on-the-ground wildlife and fisheries conservation. The majority of these funds from the excise tax on hunting and fishing equipment and permits are spent on the acquisition of new wildlife management lands and also their management, involving about 68 million acres. And so the Pittman-Robertson Hunter Education Program, it trains hunters and students on conservation values of safe and responsible use of firearms. Dingell-Johnson Act really addresses the conservation and public recreation needs in fish and estuary and marine waters. And so really monies generated from hunters and anglers are super essential to advancing the conservation mission of the service through all the reasons that I kind of just stated above. And now I'll get into the Eastern Mass Complex. You can see our map of the complex on the right there. We're situated along the Atlantic Flyway in Massachusetts. We're comprised of 8 ecologically diverse refuges. The 8 individual refuges include inlands and coastal wetlands, forests, grasslands, and barrier beaches that provide super important habitat for migratory birds, mammals, plants, reptiles, and amphibians. And so here's just a list of the refuges listed out. A little bit about our team. So our small but very mighty team, we work to manage these 8 refuges that span 18 towns, over 17,000 acres, 19,000 acres if you include easements. And so as you can imagine, this is a pretty tall task to ask of 10 permanent employees, which is why we really appreciate and value our partners and our friends group for all of their hard work and support across all program areas like bio and visitor services, maintenance, etc. And so about the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge, I won't talk too much about the history because after I present, board members Jan Bright and Chris Stahl are going to really take a deep dive into this. But as I mentioned at the beginning, these lands were traditionally inhabited and hunted and fished by the Nipmuc and Pawtucket peoples. In the 1600s, it was settled by European colonists. In 1942, the Army purchased the land for military training and munitions for World War II. So it was formerly known as the Fort Devon Sudbury Training Annex. And then in the fall of the year 2000, the Army transferred 2,300 acres to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge was established for a particular value in carrying out the National Migratory Bird Management Program. And so here's just a photo of one of the 50 bunkers that still exists on the refuge today. Again, Jan and Chris are going to talk a lot more about that. And so the refuge is about 3.5 square miles. It's in 4 different towns of Massachusetts: Hudson, Maynard, Stowe, and Sudbury. It's about 20 miles west of Boston, and it is a Big 6 refuge. So we're really fortunate that this refuge has all 6 of those priority public uses offered. And so it's comprised of a large wetland complex with several smaller wetlands and vernal pools among forested areas. I mentioned it's really important feeding and breeding areas for migratory birds and other wildlife. We have 15 miles of walking trails, 7.5 of those trails you can bike on, and the visitor center, which Paula mentioned, is currently closed for concerns of public safety. Here is the trail map of the refuge. As Paula mentioned, the Friends generously funded the purchase of these maps that are now installed in the kiosks. You can see that the trails are color coded now, and there's a little legend in the bottom left corner there showing how long each trail is. And just a couple of refuge regulations and pieces of information to keep in mind. The refuge is open, free to the public, every single day of the year, 30 minutes before sunrise, to 30 minutes after sunset. Typically, the visitor center is open Saturdays and Sundays, 10 to 4 p.m. We are a Big Six refuge, so we offer hunting and fishing opportunities. A permit and license are required. Fishing is catch and release only from the 2 fishing piers, one off of the Sandbank Trail and one by the Teardrop parking lot. You can only fish from those piers, and it's catch and release only. There are no dogs allowed to protect the resource, except of course for service animals. And as I mentioned, when I looked at the map, 15 miles of walking trails, 7.5 of those trails you can bike on as well. That's the end of my presentation. I'm going to check the chat box to see if we have any questions. Just give me a minute. My laptop's a little slow. Here we go. Doug Mackey, who used to be, no, I don't believe I am related to Doug Mackey. I'm from Connecticut. Let's see. Okay. All right, and then we just had that one other question from Barbara Vocal. Sorry that we missed that, Barbara, but it looks like Karen responded to you about the assets and the inventory. So thank you, Karen, for that. And at this time, I will turn it over to Jan Wright and Chris Stahl, both board members for the Friends of Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the history portion of the Friends annual meeting. Thank you to Kelsey for that great overview, which allows us to kind of just jump right in. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Stahl. I grew up in Sudbury. My house actually bordered the refuge, so I would walk back here a good amount. I'm going to be co-hosting this, as you heard, with longtime board member Jan Wright. We've been having fun putting this together for you guys, so we hope that you all enjoy it. I'm just going to start out showing you the refuge map here quickly, just so that we're all on the same page when Jan and I reference some locations. So this area up here by my cursor, if you can see that, we're going to be calling the North Gate, and this is the parking area. We're going to be calling this area over here East Gate, and this is where FEMA currently is. Here we are going to be calling this the main gate, and this is right along Hudson Road. This area down here we're going to be referring to as the south side of the refuge. And then again, this is White Pond Road. For those of you who are familiar with this trail, some folks from Stowe might know this as Lower White Pond Road. And then we are going to be referencing the Winterberry Way and the Visitor Center, which is right along it right here. And Winterberry Way was also known back in the day by a couple different names, such as Craven Lane, Old Marlborough Road, and also Concord Road. And I'm going to try to hide this panel. There we go. So I also just want to take a second to remind everyone, a handful of what we're showing is visible from the marked trails. However, some of the things are not. And we want to just remind everyone to please refrain from any off-trail exploration. We're going to be taking questions or comments at the end also. So if you have any you want to put in the chat box or save them in the end, or save them for the end, feel free. And we will begin. Our story of the refuge, as Kelsey mentioned, starts off recognizing the Native Americans that lived here. And one of the early conflicts that defined the land and the time period was King Philip's War. So as many of you know, in the early 1600s, 1630s-ish, the English colonists arrived, and right around 1630, the lands of the Sudbury plantation were settled following Watertown settlement. And this is current day Wayland Center. more or less. And tensions had been brewing between the arriving English colonists and the local Native Americans. By the time 1675 had rolled around, there were a lot of conflicts that kind of had boiled over, resulting in this conflict. And as it relates to Sudbury, happened on April 10th. The Native Americans were coordinated by Metacomet, and some also say Muttawamp, who was the Nipmuc sachem. But Metacomet was the sachem of the Wampanoag people, and they were of the Algonquin language. Metacomet's father was actually Massasoit, who greeted the English newcomers at Plymouth Rock, and Metacomet was his second son. The Native Americans had essentially been fed up with what was happening with their land being encroached on, and all the farmland and their passages, and they felt that they weren't going to be able to stop the Englishmen, and they were just going to be completely taken over. So they coordinated between each other and organized to essentially attack some of the settlements to try to take them back. So on the early morning of April 10th, before dawn, they all met, I believe, at some say Summer Hill in Maynard, which is just northeast of the refuge across from the Assabet River. And about 500 or so Native Americans, it said, marched to the Haines Garrison, which was on, there's a sign located right off of 27 that intersects Water Row between Sudbury and Wayland, and right along the Sudbury River. And they attacked this garrison in the early morning. The garrison was actually built to be fortified with brick walls and things like that. So they were able to absorb a lot of the musket fire that was coming from the Native Americans who had acquired these weapons in trade deals. The legend is that they lit a hay wagon on fire, which you can see here at the bottom, and they pushed it towards the garrison. However, it dislodged at the last second and did not burn down the garrison then. King Philip's War is actually known as one of the deadliest conflicts in US history per capita, just because of such low population numbers at the time, but it was a devastating event all throughout the state. In Sudbury, there was a returning militia from Marlborough that was coming to provide backup, and the Native Americans ambushed them sort of in a trap between Goodman's Hill and Green Hill. And this was Samuel Wadsworth and his men. And the fight went on for hours and hours. Eventually, the Native Americans lit fire to some of the land. Reinforcements from the Englishmen came from Charlestown and Watertown. But this battle was actually considered a victory for the Native Americans, despite high casualties on both sides. But this event is important because a lot of the settlements that had been built up in the area, a lot of the farms and homesteaders, all of that was destroyed following these conflicts. So everything following that point had to essentially be rebuilt. And that takes us to one of the earliest homesteaders that we know about on the land that is now the Assabet River Refuge. And this was the Puffer family. And we don't know too much about their background other than that they were very well off, and they were able to afford this large property just northwest of Puffer Pond, which Puffer Pond is named after. Before it is seen on maps sometimes as Pratt's Pond, but this is they moved here about the early 1700s. This was one of their early homes. And later, a family named the Andersons moved in and operated the property as a cranberry farm, utilizing Puffer Pond as the bog area. This was a second home that they had built on the same property, as you can see here, and this was one of their sheds. Another prominent location on the refuge that's really well known is the Rice Tavern, or sometimes known as the Rice Inn or Rice Farm. Today it's marked by rock just by the east gate, right next to FEMA. Actually, some of the land, I believe, is still owned by FEMA. But this is a really great photo of the house later on in 1934. It was originally conveyed in 1685 by Benjamin Crane of Stowe to Joseph Rice. And Joseph Rice was of the prominent Rice clan that was led by Edmund Rice, who was an early grantee of Sudbury and a petitioner for the plantation of Marlborough. And this inn and tavern ended up being mostly operated by Jonathan Rice and his son, Jonathan Rice Jr. The Rice family was heavily into the military. In fact, some of them were present at the battles of Lexington and Concord. There's some other military history associated with the site, and that is during the Revolutionary War, Captain Josh Berry of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, stayed here for a night with his wagon of ammunition and supplies on his journey from Portsmouth to Albany Crossing in New York. And it's said that on November 27th, 1776, the supplies was used by George Washington in the Battle of Trenton. You can see this map from 1889. This is the location of the farm and tavern. However, this is when it was owned by Jonathan Bose after, so that's why his name is listed here. Jonathan Rice Jr. was also a captain at the battles in Saratoga. You can see a really old photo of presumably the family here. There's also records in 1813 on September 9th, orders to muster were made at or by Ephraim Brigham at the Rice Tavern. And this was in relation to the French and Indian Wars in which members of the Rice family were active in. This property was heavily used by the community, including the family. There'd be a lot of important decisions made here and social gatherings and things of that nature. In 1815, the site was purchased by Jonathan Bose for private use as a farm and house. He was also a Maynard school teacher and in charge of Maynard's first public library. His son, I believe, was also a petitioner on the House and Senate to create the town of Maynard. And there were social corn husking events that were held here on Saturday evenings. Also, again, to highlight the closeness to the community, we have a photo from 1917 of a summer camp for kids that was held at Bose Pond. Right at the north gate, just a little bit south, right on White Pond Road, would have been the Ergatis house. And the Ergatises were Lithuanian immigrants that had moved to the United States in 1895. They had first moved to Connecticut near New Haven, and Simon had worked in the rubber business and moved to Chelsea, Mass with his family. His wife was Elizabeth, and they had 4 kids. And by 1926, the family moved to this house on White Pond Road. You can kind of see how the land has changed a lot since this photo was taken. There's a lot more trees. This is all essentially dense forest now. But the Ergatis' daughter, Martha, married a man named Toivo Wiki in 1934. And Toivo and Martha are actually the parents of a member of the Friends of Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge who has been present here in the past on panels for past history presentations. And his name is Bill Wiki, or people call him Wick. And this is him in the bottom right-hand corner down here, young Bill. And his father, Toivo, actually built this home himself in 1941. and it was taken by the military essentially a week later, he said. Moving along down White Pond Road would have been the Packey farm. The Packeys were Finnish immigrants. This property was originally owned by Jonathan Wood in 1785, later on by Abram Packey and his son. In 1961, this house was actually dismantled by the military, and it was moved to a private location in Sudbury. You can get an idea for kind of just how large and the scale of the farming operation that would have taken place here. This is the barn later on, after kind of the military had been through. There used to be a blacksmith shop here that burned down, and the barn was actually used as military offices and payroll administration in the 40s. You can see an old well location down here. This is, again, moving along right down south of White Pond Road. This is the Sweeko house. And the Sweekos were also a Finnish family. Otto Sweeko immigrated to the US via Ellis Island in 1899. He moved to Frontier, Wyoming to become a coal miner. He had a friend, John Manson, that lived there. He ended up marrying actually a cook in the boarding house that he lived in Frontier, Wyoming, who was also a Finnish immigrant who came to the US in 1900, also through Ellis Island, and her name was Edla Ruska. And they had a daughter named Elsie in 1912. But Otto had developed symptoms of black lung disease and was told by his doctor to find a different occupation in 1918. So they packed 3 suitcases and headed to Maynard, Mass, where Edla's brother, auntie lived. Elsie gave her neighbors her toys and took 1 doll with her. And this is where they moved. As you saw the house in the last photo in here, in spring of 1919, they purchased this 40-acre farm at 120 White Pond Road in Stowe. At the time, the property included 4 bedrooms. There was a former parlor, a sitting room, dining room, kitchen, outhouse, barn, duck pond, a milk house. Elsie actually had 2 daughters who were also in the past present for history presentation panels and have shared a lot of the photos and stories we know about this location. And they've said that these were their turkeys that lived on the farm, and they had apple and cherry trees that you can see back here. These were their family's horses, Jerry and Daisy, and you can see the barn. This is Otto and Edla up here in the top left, the year they moved from Wyoming to Massachusetts. This is a young Elsie. This is Otto and Edla at their 50th anniversary. This is Elsie here. The Beacon actually did a feature on her in 1989 about her life in Stowe. And this is Vivian and Sylvia, as you can see them here also. This map shows you where the Sweeko farm was right here. This was the Packey location, and the Argatises lived here. They were actually neighbors with a property that was owned by Henry and Clara Ford. This property was not lived on by them. It was mainly run by workers of the Wayside Inn, such as the Gateleys. But Henry Ford actually had wanted to build an airstrip here, and the Sweekos owned this little plot of land down here that interfered with Henry's plans, and he had wanted to buy this land from them, but they wouldn't sell it to him. So the airstrip was never built. They may or may not eventually have sold it to him, but the military took the land before that ever happened. These were some of Henry Ford's other properties around Sudbury. These photos and some of the other ones used here were taken by Harriet Merrifield Forbes. She has a great online collection that you can search that has a lot of old local houses around Massachusetts. This is an overhead shot of Winterberry Way, essentially, and the visitor center would have been over here to the right, kind of where my cursor is off the screen here for this photo. But this is the Whittier Farm and House that was owned by Charles and Nellie Whittier. Before them, the property was owned by the Carrs, the Cravens, and then the Whittiers, and this was a 100-acre property. It was bought by the Hill family in 1926. There were two sons, Richard and Clark Hill, who ran a shoe company in Hudson, Massachusetts. And on their commute, one day they saw this farm for sale and had mentioned it to their parents, who ended up buying it. George Hill, actually their father, died in 1927 as the result of an auto accident. And his wife Elizabeth remained in the house, and the brothers continued to operate the farm. Neither of the brothers were married at the time when they had first bought it, and there were renovations made to add dormitories on the east and west side for the brothers to live in. And then later on, in 1928, Clark Hill built what is known as the Colonel's house up here when he married. It's interesting, you can see Hill written on top of their barn here in Sudbury. So it makes you wonder how they did that. We actually have a photo coming up next of a close-up of this barn. But Clark and Richard Hill had become less and less interested in the farming aspect of living here, and they eventually pulled out all the root crops and some of the apple trees, and they decided to raise Morgan horses instead. This shows you the house as after they modernized it in 1926 to 27. They added these wings at the end. This is a photo of the horse barn after the Hills had moved out. We presume the military added this century house at the top here. But this is where they would have kept likely all their Morgan horses. This is the captain's house that I was speaking of that Richard built, Clark, and the Hills actually ended up demolishing the original Whittier house and rebuilding one of these there also. So they had two brand new homes here when the military took over, and they actually utilized both of these for the colonel and captain's homes. This is what the land looks like today. If you look at it from the walking paths along Winterberry Way, you can see some of these rock walls that are left over. And this area to the left over here is thought to be Mrs. Whittier's original rose garden, where I have a close up here of some of the bricks that are kind of in the ground there. She was an avid rose gardener. This is a pump head that can still be seen from the path. There's a flagpole here too. And again, this is right along Winterberry Way when you enter the refuge from the north gate. And I'm going to be passing it over here to Jan Wright, who's gonna talk to you about the chimney that sits up on the hill there, as well as the bricks in it and a well.
Everyone, welcome.
I think you're muted still. Sorry.
Doing that. There we go. That's good. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about the slide that you're looking at. The chimney was part of the first Hill house built in 1931 until the military took it over for officers' quarters. It then became the colonel's house from 42 to 45. The house was then abandoned. The structure is divided into two parts. It is not the entire chimney and fireplace. The lower right side was inside the great room. The higher left side was on the porch. Due to demolition, it is no longer in the original state, and Mother Nature is slowly weathering it away. You can see it from the sidewalk or Harry's Way.
Um,
What is it say? Am I, what? All right, the well on the lower left. This is a hand-dug farm well, probably done by the Carrs in 1806, since they first occupied that property, then used by the Cravens in 1858, then the Whittiers in 1907. It was still functioning when the Hills purchased the property in the 1920s. In 1931, they built the first house with the chimney, and the property had its own well. The brick on the top left. The brick is the cornerstone that signifies the Hill brothers and their ownership of the shoe factory in Hudson, Mass. The pulley surrounded by a leather strap, not unlike the fan belt in your vehicle, is a symbol of most mills in the Industrial Revolution period. The Slater Museum in Pawtucket, Rhode Island is a good example of this time. And I'm going to be quoting from Mr. Hill's notes that were given to me. Mr. Hill mentions that their factory was producing 1,440 pairs of combat boots consistently during the 42-45 period. Having an income from the military contract was a blessing after losing their property. And they received $23,000 for their farm, plus or minus 100 acres. Next. Okay, here we have Carberry House and Cottage, the Winterberry Circle, formerly Craven Lane. There were 3 houses situated at the Teardrop and Winterberry Way. I still call it Carberry Circle. The Carberry House was shared by Arthur, his parents, and 8 brothers and sisters. The cottage was built by his older brother. The brick fireplace is still on the property. On the right, the lower right, is the Costanza House, one of 2 parcels owned by the family. It was one of 62 lots developed by T.J. Riley for use as vacation camps on the south side of Puffer Pond. The area was called Arrowhead Estates due to the shape of the pond. The name did not stick, and it is called Puffer Pond today, probably due to the name of one of the first homesteaders after King Philip's War. Part of the pond is called Barron's Landing, and it was created after refuge was established. Before that, it was called Pineside for all the pine trees in the area. The name is still a mystery to its origin. One of the estate roads was Lakeshore Drive. It is now Sandbank Trail. Another was Cobley, which is Carberry Trail. Then Thomas and Richard. When you're walking either east or westbound and looking north at Puffer Pond, you can see 2 depressions in the woods. Those were Thomas and Richard roads where the estates were located. On October 3rd, 2010, I went over to the Sudbury Historical Society, and they had a program called the Black Hole. And it was a map, as you see, it was a map of Sudbury, Maynard, Hudson, and Stowe. And it was to celebrate the opening of the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge Visitors Center and the refuge itself. Now, there were 119 farm acres 98 residents and farmers that got a knock on the door. And they also all got a letter from the government. So why did the military choose a site for the depot, along with 21 others being built at this time? It was far enough away from Boston Harbor to be out of the range of enemy threats. The land was due, flat was due to the farm, so the amount of reconstruction is limited. There was plenty of help for construction, including some of the residents who needed a paycheck. They also brought prisoners from Devon to help. All the construction materials they needed were local. Nothing had to be shipped from other areas. The Cuttings Pond was the water source for the cement. The area was surrounded by wetlands to muffle the sound in case of explosions. The area was serviced by the Central Mass Railroad from Boston to the classification area on the south side of the property. The residents had little time to pack up and leave, not knowing where they were going and no income for resources. What they couldn't pack, they left behind. They had to find shelter wherever they could. One of the families, though, managed a bank loan to build a new home. The military confiscated everything that was tied down or nailed down. Most was thrown into farm dumps or burned. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of trivia that I just looked up a little bit ago. Because farmers were sustainable, they were not putting into Social Security, which started in 1935. But Social Security was voted by Congress in 1935. Now, Ernest Ackerman was the first recipient of benefits. He got a whole 17 cents in January 1937. Ida Fuller received monthly payments of $22.54, dated January 31st, 1940. Now, I had the pleasure of talking to some farmers and descendants who I asked about Social Security benefits, and they told me they did not know. But a lot of the farmers who moved managed to get employment, and some of them did retire and they did have pensions, but it took a very long time because while the government was building our depot, they were building 21 others, and it did take a long time for paychecks to get to the farmers, and most of them got 10 cents on the dollar. I believe that the Hills got the most of anyone whose areas were taken.
You're muted, right? Okay. So as Jan was mentioning, the Central Mass Railroad connected the refuge location, which was the ammo depot at the time, to the Boston port of embarkation. And this was tied to Castle Island directly through the Watertown Arsenal, which saw much expansion during World War II. When ships such as this Liberty ship down below weren't available for loading, that's when the surplus ammunition or ordnance was sent and stored at the Maynard Ammunition Backup Point. On November 10th, 1942, the annex was formally designated the Boston Backup Storage Facility, and control transferred to the commanding general of the Boston Port of Embarkation. This ship seen here is actually of rare condition. It's one of the around 2,700 or so original Liberty ships that were built for the war efforts. This one is still surviving to this day and is preserved as a museum ship in San Francisco, California, seaworthy condition in compliance with the U.S. Coast Guard, and regularly makes cruises on the bay. And this is the SS Jeremiah that was built in the East Yard in South Portland, Maine, launched originally in 1943. It was built in just 56 days. And and saw a lot of action, specifically in the European theater. And it was tied to D-Day. I read that. And a lot of these Liberty ships were lost, despite so many of them being built at such a rapid pace. There were German U-boats that shot a lot of these down, as well as issues with the hull and cracking that took place. But this is where the ships would have loaded up, connected to the Central Mass Railroad. This is the Castle Island Terminal at the Boston Port of Embarkation. Today, this is the Boston Reserve Channel, and this is the Raymond J. Flynn Black Falcon Cruise Terminal, or Raymond L. Flynn, excuse me. But a lot of the sailors and the merchant marines would have either loaded onto the ships from up top here or down below. And these cranes would have done a lot of the loading from the trains, which you can see the tracks down here. So as I was saying, it was connected to this point, the ammo depot by the Central Mass Railroad. And as the excess ammo came in, it would have been shipped west along the Central Mass Railroad line. And you can see where this red dot is where the unloading point at what is today the refuge would have been. And this is the ammo train coming through the Belmont Curve. There would have been 2 engines at the front and 2 at the back. This was for dynamic braking purposes. A full load would have been about 96 cars front to back. However, from Boston to Wayland was about 125 feet above sea level, over 20 miles or so. So the trains were only able to move half loads from Boston to Wayland, at which point they would set that aside and go back for the other half. They would use a turntable and then connect both loads together and continue on through Sudbury to the annex. So this is a photo of the Wayland station in 1947, as well as an engine. You can see the Wayland Library behind it, actually here on the left. This is what it looks like today. People know it as the gift shop or the Wayland Depot. There's a brand new rail trail there that you can walk along. This is a photo that Jan took, a really good one of the turntable remains still there. This would have been continuing west, the South Sudbury station in 1954. Here on the right, people knew this as Crumble Station. I believe they served cookies and things of that nature. People were very fond of. This is the former location of AAA Limousine, right along Union Ave in Sudbury, just across from Sudbury Lumber. The train would have continued on, passing through about one more stop, kind of near Wayside, and then would have continued on here where a track modification was built to allow the engines to come in. And this would have been a 7-track wide classification yard. This map shows you all the track that was put in for the work that was passed over to a switch engine seen here. This was diesel powered to minimize sparks. And these are all 50 bunker locations and the train lines that service them, crossing over what is Hudson Road from the south side of the refuge. This is a close-up of what we were just looking at. The modification that was made was called a Y track modification, and this is spelled W-Y-E, and it's actually a railroad term to just signify a track that literally looks like the letter Y, as you can see here. And this was so that the train, the engine could have pulled in, unloaded the cars, and then back out and essentially go back to Boston. So this is the track classification yard here. You can see some of these marked squares, 32, 22, 21. These would have been sentry houses for guard shacks. You can see on the south side, there used to be some admin buildings, storage and their water intake from White's Pond. This is some of the track that's actually still left over, or this photo is from 2009, but it's still there, right kind of at the main gate at Hudson Road. If you look close enough, you can see where this is, and you can kind of see where the old train line would have run through. This was one of the last buildings that the military installed when they took over the land in 1942. This was the main gate and control room / guardhouse. There is actually an electric room in the back here that serviced the lighting for the perimeter fencing. Other than that, the base operated under stealth. No lights were allowed in the bunker areas. People at the time before they knew the site was being taken over had to do nightly blackouts in preparation, where they would have to shut their windows and turn off all their lights. This is what the control room interior looked like years later. These would have been some of the machines that powered the electricity for the perimeter lighting along the fences. Just past the main gate would have been Switchman's cabin, where the train lines were switched around for the switch engine, and Jan is going to talk to you more about this.
Thanks, Chris. Hi again. Okay, the Switchman's Cabin, Tri-Town Trail. When you come in the main gate off Hudson Road, the kiosk is directly in front of you at the parking area. There are 2 trailheads behind it. The left is Pettapawag Trail, which takes you to Towey. The other is Tri-Town. The cabin was at the intersection of Tri-Town and Pine Garden. The photo is looking east across the trail. Personnel occupying the structure did the switch to allow the trains to continue the loop north and south. The first time I was there, I found an inverted brass bowl with a lever in a slot at the trail intersection. It was the track switch. The next time it was by the cabin. It had feet. The next time it was gone, as was the structure. So I assume that the brass bowl was stolen, and the structure, well, Mother Nature got it. The marker on the bottom left on the ground designates 3 towns, Maynard, Stowe, and Hudson. Well, somebody called it Tri-Town for a reason. It is flagged. As with all boundary marks, they are surveyed regularly, and we have several in the depot right now that have been recently surveyed. Here are some watchtowers and sentry houses that were located around the perimeter and inside the depot. The top left was at the north gate. The bottom left was on the old patrol road. Watchtowers and sentry houses were placed about a quarter mile apart. And the bottom right, if anybody knows anything about Summerhill Trail in Maynard, I believe this was there. And if anybody can tell me any different, I'd certainly like to know. Okay. So why did they build the bunker igloo, as the Army called them, that they chose? Now, there's a place in Dover, New Jersey called Picatinny Arsenal. It was Navy, and alongside of it is Lake Denmark, which was Army. An arsenal is where they make explosives. A depot is where they store the same. Give you a little history here. In 1749, Jonathan Osborne purchased land, built a dam, and erected a forge. It produced cannon shot, bar iron, shovels, axes, and iron implements for George Washington's Continental Army. And that forge is still there, or the memorial of the forge is still there, pretty much as you enter at the gate. These organizations are located in the Picatinny Mountains in Dover, New Jersey. The depot is sitting at the top of the hill and holds munitions made at the arsenal. The photo on the left shows the employee pouring powder into a shell casting. All materials of this nature are made by hand to diminish its explosions. The photo on the right shows explosives sitting on trains. I'm sorry, on the right. Yes, the right. I'm not dyslexic. The photo on the right, explosives sitting on the trains to transfer finished products to an 8-tile covered magazines. Both areas employed around 8,000 people. On Saturday, July 10th, 1942, a skeleton crew worked. At 5:15 p.m., a thunderstorm went overhead and a bolt of lightning struck storehouse number 8. There were 670,000 pounds of high explosives stored there. It blew. It took 3 hours for all stored explosives in all magazines to detonate with a ripple effect because they were so close. 3 days saw complete devastation to the area, as well as structures over a mile away. Captain Reingold, United States Army, created a survey committee to determine what caused the explosions and the kind of magazine that was better for holding explosives. After many tries with several different types, they came up with the arch cement igloo type 49 that we use today. They decided on this type because it didn't explode, it imploded, which was safer to personnel nearby igloos. It also saved space, so it could be built closer together and fire equipment was able to cover more area. Now, we can see all the devastation that was caused by the fires and explosions. And the bottom slide, the bottom picture shows the two areas where the two magazines were that were so close. Okay, we have a bunker. I am sober. We have a bunker under construction. This was not ours. This was from Fort Worth, but you can see how it was being built and the cover over the top, the air vent in the back, and the wing wall that's way to the left. Okay, here's bunker storage. This again is not ours. There are beams in the ceiling and it says no smoking, and you wonder why. It has double doors. Ours does not. It has numbers on the floors. Ours did. And you can see how inventory was being regulated. They were on pallets. And at this time, IBM punch cards are being used to allow inventory to be very accurate. An imploded bunker. After many tries, this is what they decided they were going to use. There were around 18 inches of cement on the lower floors and approximately 6 inches of cement on the top of the building. And this allowed it to implode, which saved a lot of personnel and of course the igloos next to it. And it also allowed closer building of the igloos and saving space And if the war had kept on, we would have had another 20 or 30. But because the war ended, we have 50. Okay, you can see the classes of stored ammunition. These are all inert, which means that they wouldn't explode because you need something, a catalyst, to have this happen. And in each door of our bunkers, there was a note that said, limit is 25,000 pounds, which Picatinny Arsenal or Lake Denmark did not have. Here we have some characters doing their job on electric forklift, and they are inside of an igloo, ours, or one of ours, and they are handling palletized ammunition with the forklift. And it has the bunker has a single door, which is ours. Now, one of my favorite things in the whole world to talk about, my bunker 303. I'm going to talk about this. One of 50 on the refuge and the closest to the visitor center. Before a tour, I personally check it inside now to confirm that the safety and cleanliness of the building is up to par for visitors. This igloo do not contain explosives, only herbicides and pesticides to eliminate weeds around the tracks in the buildings. And it was also closest to the maintenance building, which was where we are sitting now in the visitor center. There are two pictures here of 303. And when Natick Labs, when it was originally built, they did the numbering from 1 to 50. But when Natick Labs was here, they just designated them 300. And someday I'm going to find out why. Okay, there are two pictures of it here, one with one and one without a ramp. The ramp was built for those who couldn't access the steps. The top left shows the bunker platform, the blast door, and the wing wall. It holds the door up, which weighs a ton. The door is made of two steel sheets that were shimmed together to allow the blast bucket and counterweight to allow fresh air to flow through and keep possible detonation in. Now I see on the bottom left are some inscriptions from some of the workers here. They were local, they came from far and wide, and every time I have a bunker tour, I point out this very historical part of the bunker. The platform and box cars are the same level off the ground to allow sufficient unload of inventory. There is an eye bolt above the door to allow leverage of loading, unloading cargo to and from the igloo and boxcar or trucks. And somebody I just met recently as a young man, he lives over in Lake Boone, and he used to climb a down tree across the fence over on Sudbury Road. And he told me that he used to come over, sneak around and watch all kinds of activity. And I asked him if he had ever seen a train. And he said, I saw lots of tracks, but I never saw a train, just trucks. Okay, on the rear top is the airflow vent tower. This was manually controlled to allow fresh air flow through the igloo to keep the inventory dry and cool. And the igloo is covered with 17 feet of dirt around the structure to keep the inside cool and also for concealment from above. There is a plastic cover over the top and sides to keep it dry. And just a little sidebar here. I used to fly a light plane out of Minuteman, and we used to fly over here at a given altitude and couldn't really see the bunkers. So the concealment was official and it was well done. Okay. Here is a reason that Picatinny probably blew. The lightning arrestor system. On the top left, there is a pole, as is across the road is another pole. And from pole to pole, there is a wire. And on one of those poles would have been a lightning rod. Bottom left is the bucket and the counterweight that was kept closed. And if there was an explosion, it was open for fresh air. And if there was an explosion, it would have closed to minimize problems. Top right is the blast door and hasp closing it, and the counterweight again. And on the bottom right is the copper wire that goes all the way around the bunker, goes up through the platform and down into the ground. So every bunker igloo was totally grounded for this problem, which is why we never had an explosion here. Okay. Around each bunker was either a water tower, fire equipment that held 10,000 gallons, or a berm in front. So if there was an explosion, the berm would eliminate any problems and lighting up the woods, if you will. And there was, over where the fire academy is now, was an acre of land in the woods that was fire equipment, staging area for all that fire equipment.
Okay. And in the north area of the refuge, right by the north gate, was a firefighting research and development area. And there was a bunch of fire equipment here up by the north gate. And they would have different rooms set up, such as the remains of this one scene in the bottom right. And they would test clothes with different types of atmospheric interference, such as dust, fire, or water on different types of gear. There was testing of first responder clothes that took place. There were buildings up here that had endless amounts of mannequins in them from all the equipment that was tested on them. This area ended up becoming a pretty extensive dump site to a degree. There were all these pipes underground and tanks and equipment scattered everywhere, but that was all cleaned up. And this is what it looks like today. It's actually the site of a new garage that stores a lot of the maintenance equipment for the refuge. And moving along down White Pond Road again, actually, this is what happened to the Squeako house. It was actually turned into more or less a pseudo guard shack with the fences moving along it. And actually, Vivian and Sylvia's father, John Juanatelo, actually came back to work on this property in one of the Century houses after they were forced to move. And there would have been all types of research taking place here after the war, after kind of they didn't need it as an ammo depot anymore. The Army and the Navy utilized it for research in addition to other contractors, and a lot of that would have taken place back here. One of the companies that first started out was Universal Match Company in the 50s. This was one of the original buildings that they used. Then by 1962 to 82, actually, Natick Labs took over a lot of the buildings back here and did a lot of the research. And these were kind of the remains of the buildings, photos taken later on White Pond Road. We're actually really lucky to be able to share these next two photos with you. This was on the west side of the refuge in what is currently the closed area. This was an Air Force research facility, and these photos were provided to us by a member of the Retired Men's Association after we gave a similar history presentation to them. He sent these to us afterwards, and we were given approval to share them with everyone. So really excited about that. They're really great quality photos and show you some of the structures that were being used by the Air Force for research throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, actually. And work actually continued here into the early 2000s, but then not long after. This photo here was from 1969. It's kind of cool to see all the cars of the day parked here, and some of the satellite dishes. I believe they were doing geophysical radar testing. This is across Hudson Road, actually on the south side of the refuge. In the early 2000s, these buildings were here. They no longer are, but this one at the top was used by the Air Force for parachute testing, and this one at the bottom by Raytheon for radar cold testing. So here's some volunteers dismantling what were Air Force and Army obstacle courses that were used in the 1990s. I believe the state police also trained here, and many soldiers out of Fort Devens came to this area to prepare for the Gulf War, and this was after the fact. So before the site was cleaned up, there was trash everywhere. There's kind of ongoing site investigations and cleanup since the early 80s. It actually began before that by Arthur D. Little right after the war, but then later on, following all the research and such, the U.S. Army Sudbury Annex was added to a national priorities list under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA, of 1980, and this established the official U.S. federal Superfund program. In September of 95, the base was designated for cessation of operations and closure with a target date of 1997. It's also worth noting that even after it was transferred the property to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, there were still certain sections that were utilized by the Air Force, FEMA, and some small parcels on the south side that were used still as Army housing. This is an example of one of the areas of concern at the time. This was Taylor Way, and there were about 18 inches of dirt that had to be replaced here, but it's all cleaned up along with all the other areas of the refuge. Everyone did great work. We wanted to give you guys kind of a look around the gates today, just to contrast it with some of the images we've been showing you throughout this presentation. So this is the main gate along Hudson Road. This is where the Friends helped some landscaping work, and winterberry bushes were put in, as Paula mentioned earlier. This is a bridge that was actually put in 2007 on the north side of the refuge, just before the north gate, and this is the Assabet River. This is when you drive across, you see this is where the new parking area is and the new maintenance garage up here to the right. This is the east gate next to FEMA, as I was mentioning earlier, where the Rice Tavern is located, just in the woods here. Should be next to one of these trees, although you can't see it in this photo, but you can definitely easily see it if you are walking along the path. I'm gonna pass it back over to Jan here, who is gonna thank everyone.
Thanks again, Chris. We thank you for your interest in the refuge and our presentation. And our history project is ongoing. And if you have any comments or information that would contribute to the authenticity of the presentation, they would be gladly accepted. If anybody knows anybody, Chris and I are waiting for Waltham to open so we can go talk to the researchers and libraries and historical societies. So this is ongoing, and this is probably maybe going to be changed again, but not too much. Thank you again.
Thank you again for attending the annual meeting this evening. And if you have any questions at all that you'd like to quickly tap into the chat box, we can stay for a couple minutes. Otherwise, we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you again for attending.
So we do have a question. I saw the remains of a log cabin. What was it?
The log cabin is situated off of Harry's Way, and it was made out of bits and pieces by Mr. Lent, who also allowed Boy Scouts to use it, and it was just a log cabin that he built. And he had a wonderful kind of wharf off of the side there. So if you were looking at the if you were looking at the, no, let's say if you were on the old fishing dock and looking right across the pond, that's where the cabin would have been. And there is, I have a couple photos of it when I first saw it, and it was really pretty nice. And that's what it was just a cabin.
It looks like we have another question from Don. Don asks, when the bunkers were in service during the war, was there any foliage on top of the bunkers?
The foliage, yes, they started planting trees right away. It was for concealment. Yep.
Thank you, Jan. It looks like we have another question from Jeff. Okay, so are all the bunkers still in place? Yes, all 50 of them, 50, are still on the refuge. We use one of the bunkers for storage. The rest of them are locked and empty. We have a question from Jeff. Will the closed portion of the refuge where the United States Air Force operated be cleaned and opened? So we actually are in the process of clearing the last bits of debris from the Air Force buildings. And we are still in the process of cleaning up that area. In terms of it opening, I don't have any good information on that. It is possible that in the next, 5 or more years, the refuge will consider opening it, but I don't have any information on any plans to open that area at this time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for all of your questions. And thank you again for attending the meeting, and have a nice evening.